Hello again and welcome. I'm Dr. Joanne Lisosky, journalist, author, and journalism educator. We are talking about things of interest to the South Caucasus, and we're joined again today by Paul A. Goble, former special advisor to U.S. Secretary of State on Russian Affairs, and he is currently the author of the blog Windows on Eurasia. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you for having me back.
We've just heard from Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that it's believed that in Russia, the Washington-brokered Armenian Azerbaijan agreements were more of a U.S. publicity stunt than a genuine peace breakthrough. He noted that initial enthusiasm quickly gave way to skepticism once the details were published, and he warned that without follow-up, this agreement just remains a flash in the pan. How would you comment on that?
What would one expect the Russian foreign minister to say other than that, to dismiss any agreement that was reached without Russian participation? Foreign Minister Lavrov is correct that the agreement that was signed by the two leaders is a long way from a peace agreement. There are an awful lot of issues that have to be explored and have written down. It was a major step forward, but it is not sort of a peace for all time in the South Caucasus. And a lot more things have to be discussed. The important thing is that it be discussed by the two parties themselves rather than involving the Russians as they want to, because they have consistently over the past 30 years gotten in the way of an agreement. Whenever the two sides have been close to an agreement, Moscow has done what it can to prevent that from happening. Now that it looks like Mr. Pashinyan and Mr. Aliyev have agreed to the core principles of how to go forward, the Russians are doing the same. What Mr. Lavrov has said is simply one of the opening salvos of a Russian attempt to torpedo what was agreed in Washington. It's true, a lot more work needs to be done, a lot more discussions need to flesh out what was declared. This is not the kind of issue that you can solve in 1 page or even 20 pages. It's going to take a great deal of work. Having said that, it succeeded as far as it did, because in fact, it was an agreement between the Prime Minister of Armenia and the President of Azerbaijan, rather than an agreement introduced by someone else. The American understanding, at least under the Trump administration, of brokering is not to give a solution, but to create a situation where the two sides can agree. The Russian approach is to involve Russia to make sure that no agreement is reached at all.
So Lavrov also pointed back to the November 2020 communique that was signed by our Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Russian leaders, stressing just the other day that no country has actually left that agreement. How should we read this? Is Moscow signaling that it still sees the 2020 Russian brokered deal as the only legitimate framework?
Well, first off, the 2020 declaration was exactly that. It was a declaration, it was not an agreement. It was even shorter than the Washington agreement. It was long on declarative language, short on real solutions. It was intended to stop the 44-day war, to open the door for greater Russian military presence on the ground, and to make sure that it would refreeze the conflict. The events that have happened since that time, including Azerbaijan's retaking of the entire Karabakh area, have made that null and void. It is simply not true that what was signed in Moscow as a declaration in November 2020 is anything like what was signed in Washington last month. It's not that the one was a tripartite agreement involving a third party, and not just Armenia and Azerbaijan. What was signed in Washington was essentially the result of an agreement of negotiations between the leaders of the two countries immediately involved. That Mr. Trump hosted it is true, But the idea that it was an American intervention that caused an agreement, a new declaration to be made, is, I think, excessive. I think what did happen is working with both Baku and Yerevan, the idea of an American rental of a corridor, of managing the corridor between Azerbaijan and the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan was a way forward that allowed the squaring of the circle, if you will, and especially the declaration we know now that the two sides agreed that there would not be third country military presence on that corridor. Reassured Iran, meant that Iran was not likely to torpedo this, and froze out other countries, Turkey possibly, but also the Russian Federation. And the Russian Federation is not happy about that, because the basis of its policy in the South Caucasus has been divide and rule. Whenever you have a problem with Azerbaijan, you play up your friendship with Armenia. And whenever you have a problem with Armenia, you play up your friendship with Azerbaijan. By the Washington Agreement, if we want to call it that, Russia can't do that anymore, at least effectively. That it's still going to try, because that's what it has always done, we see in Mr. Lavrov's remarks.
So is it a coincidence that this sharper tone from Russia came right after consultations with China and others? Why was Moscow largely silent for a month or more after the Washington discussion, and is now choosing to speak out?
Well, I think that there have been two major meetings since international meetings, as far as Russia is concerned, during that month. One was the Beijing Assembly, and the other was the Far Eastern Economic meeting in Vladivostok. Lavrov, like any foreign minister, is not going to want to overshadow what his president is doing. Everyone knew those meetings were coming. You don't talk about other things until those are in the past. This is simply a scheduling issue. I'm quite sure that Mr. Lavrov could have come up with exactly the same language 3 weeks ago had there not been the meetings in Beijing and the meetings in Vladivostok. But it wasn't those meetings as negotiations, but those meetings as publicity for his boss, the president of the Russian Federation. And I think that had you raised the issue of the Azerbaijani-Armenian Accord, what you would have done is highlight a place where Russian power is clearly in recession. That's not an image that Mr. Putin would have wanted to carry into either of those meetings. So I think it's a mistake to think there were any negotiations with China about this, or with anyone else in either China or in Vladivostok. I think this was about not embarrassing Putin, allowing him to go in without somebody having called attention to this. That's the fact that it took a month is only because of the schedule of those two meetings, not because of talks, as far as I can see.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about the recent SCO summit. This looked like a huge parade and a big show of strength. After it, how much was really changed, and what does it mean for the South Caucasus with both Aliyev and Pashinyan taking part?
Well, I think the fact that both took part, this is one more agreement, or one more diplomatic meeting. I tend to share the view that this meeting didn't mean nearly as much as its publicity suggested. People were excited because Putin was supposedly ending his diplomatic isolation by talking to all these leaders, that the SCO was being held up as the new alliance to challenge American power, and the journalists fell right into the trap of repeating what the Kremlin wanted them to say. The fact is, what agreements came out of it? Well, a lot fewer than we expect. Supposedly, there was an agreement between Putin and Xi to build a second gas pipeline out of Russia into China. Well, we now see that the Russians wanted the Chinese to pay for it. The Chinese didn't want to pay for it unless they were able to put their people inside Russia to build it. So it's not going anywhere fast. There was another agreement of these 24 agreements that were celebrated between Russia and China. The Chinese agreed to lift visa requirements for parties of 2 Russians in country for 30 days or less. I think that's the final format that we know of so far. The expectation was that Russia would respond by doing the same thing with respect to Chinese entering into the Russian Federation. But the difference between Russians going to China, where there would be perhaps a few thousand Russians who would travel as tourists to China, and thousands more Chinese going into the underpopulated part of the Russian Federation, is fundamentally different in terms of Russian interest. Surprise, surprise, despite expectations, despite predictions in Washington, in Moscow, and elsewhere, the Russians didn't respond. They didn't agree. So if you want to talk about what a great meeting this was, it was certainly a wonderful photo op. Was it a meeting that put together a new alliance against the United States and the West? I don't think so. I share the views of Vladislav Inozemtsev, who says the West is making far too much of this meeting. It isn't going to matter nearly as much in the coming months as its PR workers from Moscow are pushing. It's the kind of thing that people love. There's all the pomp and circumstance. There are all these leaders. There's Putin, who's talking about how this ends my diplomatic isolation. There are people who are saying, oh, look, there's an agreement with India. There's an agreement between China and Russia. But if you start looking at what those agreements actually are, they aren't nearly as impressive or as numerous. That isn't to say there were none. It would be tough to imagine that there would be a meeting like this where you wouldn't have some agreements that were real. But the idea that there was this huge outburst of activity that led to a new set of alliances. And let's point out another thing. This meeting was supposed to celebrate China and Russia's integration. Last month, the trade between the two countries declined more than it has in the past decade. It declined precipitously as China stopped buying an awful lot of Russian things because Russian financial arrangements are such that it isn't profitable for China to do that. So again, I don't think one can ignore a meeting where there are that many leaders. I think, however, it's a big mistake to think that this was a turning point in the geopolitics of the world. Will it have some effect in the South Caucasus? Possibly. It will certainly give the Chinese entree into Baku and Yerevan that they've sought, but haven't always exercised. They've sought, but this was not going to be easy. What I think you will see is the Chinese will expand their activities, but how far they will get will depend on calculations in Baku and Yerevan about not only what do the Chinese really want and who are they working for, and how can we use the Chinese to play off other people, namely the Iranians and the Russians. And I think that those who want to see what's going to happen in Baku and Yerevan should look first and foremost to Baku and Yerevan and not meetings in China or the Russian Far East.
But what about the blocking of Armenia and Azerbaijan from joining the SCO? Where did that come from? Who instigated that? And what's the logic behind that?
Oh, I think that it's a pressure ploy by the Russians. They're unhappy that the Azerbaijanis are working with the Ukrainians, providing weapon systems and taking a very tough line against Moscow's behavior. They're unhappy with the Armenians because the Armenians are cozying up with the EU, if not yet NATO, although I personally think that will probably come possibly in the Trump years, but eventually. And so I think that the Russians basically said, we're not going to let you into SCO until we're sure you're not going to join NATO and the EU. I think it was a response to what Azerbaijan and Armenia themselves were doing. Again, I think the story here is not what Putin was trying to do, not what China was trying to do, but the fact that the Armenians and Azerbaijanis were acting as far more independently than they had in the past, and that Moscow and Beijing are having to react to that rather than thinking they could control the situation. That's an important step forward. Always before, when we've talked about what goes on in the South Caucasus, we've talked about what do the Russians want, how will they orchestrate Armenia or Azerbaijan against one another in order to maximize their position. What we're talking about now is that the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis are talking to one another. They're working closer to an agreement, and they're acting as much more independent countries than they did before. That, I think, is the big story of the last month, not whether the Russians have said, no, you can't get in the SCO. The reason the Russians are saying that is because they're upset with the fact that the Armenians and Azerbaijanis are both acting like truly independent state actors. And that is a big step forward. That's what we should be paying attention to.
So this week we saw the official end of the Minsk Group on September 1st, the OSCE.
Well, actually, it's good. December 31st. They're 31st, wrapping it up. Right. They voted on September 1 unanimously to wrap it up by the end of this year. So international organizations never disappear quickly.
What comes next if the Minsk Group is gone, though?
Well, I think the Minsk Group is gone, and I think the Minsk Group is irrelevant. I think the Minsk Group was designed for two things that are no longer true. The first is it was designed to figure out how to deal with Armenian occupation of large portions of Azerbaijan. And second, it was designed to figure out how you could get an agreement with the Russians still very much on the ground. The Minsk Group, as you know, had the Russians as co-chair. Having the French, the Russians, and the Americans as the co-chair meant that nothing much was going to happen, and nothing much did. It was predicated on the idea that somehow outsiders would tell the Armenians and Azerbaijanis what they had to accept. That was the whole point, that it was going to be the international community coming in and being a deus ex machina to impose a settlement that would solve everything. Some of us argued that it got in the way of the direct bilateral negotiations at many levels between Baku and Yerevan. That was going to be the only way you were going to get people actually to talk to one another, to come to an agreement. It wasn't easy. It's still not completely done, but the progress that has been made is striking. Armenians and Azerbaijanis are talking to each other at all levels, and I think there's reason for hope that more progress will be made in the coming weeks. I don't think we're talking months anymore. I think we're talking weeks. And I think that that is because nobody on the outside, not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the Americans, is going to impose a settlement. Those days are over, if they indeed ever existed. It's because the Armenians and Azerbaijanis are acting in their own national interests and coming to an agreement. I was impressed the other day by the fact that the Prime Minister of Armenia was flying over Azerbaijani territory. Who ever thought we would live to see that day? And he announced it. That's quite amazing. And nothing happened. I think that's why we're talking about a fundamentally different situation, but it's a fundamentally different situation because of what's happening in Baku and Yerevan, not what's happening in Moscow or Beijing.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship with Azerbaijan and Russia. Putin admitted at his press conference that these relations have problems, yet he still briefly met with Aliyev, shaking hands with him and his wife. Is the tension now behind us, or do we see that maybe bubbling up?
No, the tension between Baku and Moscow is not behind us. Azerbaijan is going to be angry for as long as one can imagine about the shooting down of its plane, about the attacks on ethnic Azerbaijanis in the Russian Federation. It's upset with the Russians' efforts to coordinate with Iran against Azerbaijan. And so that isn't going to go away. That doesn't mean that the Azerbaijanis will not seek, in their own interests, to develop better relations with Russia than they have today. But it does mean they're not going to be willing to go back to where they were, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. Azerbaijan has grown up in a way, and everybody needs to start paying attention to what Azerbaijanis think, what Azerbaijanis are doing, how Azerbaijanis view the world, than constantly being obsessed about where Azerbaijan is with respect to the Kremlin. I think, obviously, Azerbaijan has to worry about its relations with Russia, but those relations are not going to be a sweetheart deal anytime soon, if ever. I just don't see that happening. I doubt, because I don't think we have a West that's prepared to do it, but I don't think that we're going to see Azerbaijan and or Armenia move into Western structures really quickly. I think the Americans are simply not up to that task just now. And I think the Europeans are honest enough with themselves to know that integrating with the EU as opposed to joining NATO is a very complicated process. The number of things you have to change in your country to become an EU country is very large. I mean, people tend to forget NATO is a defense alliance. To join a defense alliance means you can make a contribution to defense. You don't even have to have an army. One of the founding members of the NATO alliance was Iceland, which doesn't have a military, but it was, of course, and remains very important as a unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the Atlantic, and therefore it's part of the alliance. You could decide, if you were so inclined, to make almost any country a member of NATO, and it could be done very quickly if the core countries of NATO were prepared to push for it. I don't see President Trump of the United States pushing for anything like that anytime soon. He seems not willing to challenge Russia on other things. I don't see him doing that. On the other hand, there are people in Europe, the Germans, for example, who probably are not opposed. They weren't enthusiastic earlier, but they didn't face a Russia that they now face. And so I think that's not impossible, certainly after another U.S. presidential election, but it's going to be a while. With respect to joining the EU, I don't see the Azerbaijanis moving in the direction of the European Union, but I do see the Armenians, and it will be because their economy is smaller, because they have a special relationship with France already. I think we're going to see Armenia have an action plan very soon on joining the EU. That's much more pointed in the direction of membership than anything we've seen so far. And so I would not be surprised if we start thinking about an Armenia in the European Union maybe next year, end of next year. It could go fairly fast. It's easy. Changing Azerbaijan would require rather more steps than changing Armenia. So as I say, NATO membership, anybody can do overnight if there's a will to do it. Joining the EU is a bit more complicated because the EU requires that you bring all these laws and regulations and currency operations into alignment with one another. That's not easy. There were too many people in the early 90s who saw EU membership and NATO membership as somehow interchangeable steps. It was foolish. They're both necessary. I hope I live long enough to see both Armenia and Azerbaijan in both organizations. We'll see. But I think that it's important to keep in mind these are different institutions with very different requirements. And both countries, I think, will ultimately pursue them.
So let's talk a little bit again about the tension between Russia and Azerbaijan. Do you think any of it stems from Azerbaijani oil and gas exports, which Moscow may view as a direct competition?
No, I don't think that's nearly as important as two other things. The first is that Azerbaijan is on the main route north-south between Russia and Iran. If Russia is going to project power into South Asia, it's got to have a route. It's got a huge problem. There isn't enough rail capacity east of the Caspian. The Caspian Sea, as we know, is drying up. The ports are no longer usable by the bigger ships, and so that's cutting back its ability. The best way to go is ultimately to knock the tunnels through a portion of northern Iran, and then link up Russian through Azerbaijan through Iran to the Indian Ocean. I think that Moscow cares very, very much about that. If it doesn't have that kind of link, it's not going to be the player in South Asia that it wants to be. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Azerbaijan had supplied some of the migrant workers into Russia. Now that's not going to happen anymore. The behavior of the Russian government and Russian nationalists against ethnic Azerbaijanis means that's gone. I don't see Russia being able to recover its position on that anytime soon. I think the interesting question will be, what will Azerbaijan do domestically to handle the return of those people? Because that will put a strain on the Azerbaijani budget. It's something I think they can easily afford, given oil. But it is a problem for Russia in the first instance, because if the Azerbaijanis, as you undoubtedly know, were the people who built the oil industry in Russia, that they were the people who were brought north from Baku, where the oil industry got its start in this part of the world, and developed the fields in the Middle Volga, around Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. They still have an impact there. It's not accidental that the place where the Russians had problems with the diaspora were in the Urals, exactly there, because those are either the descendants of or participants in the oil industry of the Russian Federation. Those are two big issues we should be watching. I just don't think the Russians are afraid of Azerbaijani competition. The third issue has less to do with Azerbaijan itself than a historical Russian fear, especially now that we're going to see some kind of corridor traffic through Syunik, Zengezur, that Turkey will be in a position to project power across this entire region, cutting Russia off from Iran, extending a Turkish influence to the 4 Turkic countries of Central Asia, plus Tajikistan, which is Persian-speaking, but essentially much more Turkic in orientation. The Russians are worried about that, but that's an issue they have to deal with respect to Turkey rather than Azerbaijan. I don't see Ilham Aliyev being willing to change his position one iota about the unity of Turks and Azerbaijanis and the use of Turkish power to help Azerbaijan, not only in its own region, but across the Caspian into Central Asia. If you want to go back to, we were talking about China, that's going to be where the Chinese are going to be involved too, because they obviously want access to Europe somehow, in the trade access. And if the Turks can develop that line through Azerbaijan, then China is going to want to be a part of that too, and Russia is going to be worried. But it's not Azerbaijani production that's going to bother the Russians very much. It's the fact that this is about Turkey. This is about geopolitics. And I think we have to focus on the right things. It's easy to be distracted by what are superficially important issues, but in fact turn out on examination to be less so.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for your insights. We'll be coming back to you for more questions and hopefully more answers about what's happening in the South Caucasus sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne.